Of all the cinematic new waves to emerge in the 60s, the Czechoslovak crusade of new wave was the most pivotal, essentially reforming arts, politics, and society within the country. The great minds behind the movement had seen war, Nazi occupation, and the beginning of the sexual revolution. In a direct response to these experiences, they pioneered change and modified the worldview of the cinematic frontier while they rebuilt a better society, free from Soviet censorship. These brave directors used film as a double-edged sword of revolutionary fascination to absorb other countries into political resistance against the hypocrisy and absurdity of the communist state. Distinguished by their embrace of the surreal through eccentric, dreamlike visions and experimental editing, as well as their macabre and bawdy Czech humor, these films were the voices of a repressed generation. At the end of World War II, the Yalta Conference agreed on the Soviet and Western spheres of influence, and the Red Army faction was allowed to liberate Prague. In 1948, the Soviet rise to power displayed the strong communist traditions in Czechoslovakia and the willingness to get back a semblance of normalcy. With the Soviet Union working with the Western Allies, the leader of the exiled democratic government, Edvard Beneš, and the communist leader Klement Gottwald naturally formed an alliance. This was a remarkable union and created a new ideology of Czechoslovak socialism that would prioritize nationalism, democracy, and communism without following the typical Soviet model of government. When Soviet presence ended 3 years later, Gottwald was able to ensure communist rule in government, and the Communist Party rose in the ranks once again. In 1952, the Secretary General of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, Rudolf Slansky, was put on trial, convicted, and executed, having been charged with Zionism. Thus, the sweep of anti-communism and political persecution began. Slansky's fate was shared by the rest of the Eastern Europeans who turned their backs on the tidal wave of reform. In 1956, following Khrushchev's famous speech at the 20th Party Congress, there began a period of de-Stalinization. Although lacking extensive reform, it was immediately succeeded by a self-examination of arts and politics, serving as a reminder of the dire state of affairs. The situation in Czechoslovakia was desperate for change, with industry, economy, and agriculture all deteriorating. The intellectual revolt that ensued in 1963 resulted from the pressures in regards to liberalization and the economic failure of the regime. In January 1963, the Slovak Writers' Union called a symposium to discuss the issues with censorship and applications of media in society. The present members chastised the corruption of prose, attacked the traditions of social realism, and complained of the isolation of Czech media and literature from the outside world. This called attention to the rehabilitation needed within the arts and set the stage for the Prague Spring reforms. The reforms of the 60s resulted from a return to traditions that had laid dormant during the Stalinist period. Flourishing ideas and hunger for the arts were a spontaneous yet calculated response to de-Stalinization. Since the censorship ended, the repressed nature of society sought to find its medium and expression. It was through film that attitudes and viewpoints of the Czech people were finally reflected and acknowledged. The true beginning of this Grandois era was pioneered by Miloš Forman, Vera Hekalova, and Jaromil Jiriš, all FAMU students looking forward to the development of 60s cinema through thematic and transitory breaks within the conventions of socialist realism. The students of FAMU became the dissenters of their time, fueled by the desire to create a new vision of life for emerging Czech politics and art. The most significant prerequisite to the new wave was the diva style of the 30s, a revolution for art, life, and politics, which rooted itself in poetism and artistic production of cinema with an avant-garde nature. Combined with the artistic direction of diva-style filmmakers, these harbingers of truth would finally break through the frontier of cinema with their anti-communist and anti-censorship sentiments. Forman's 1963 releases, Competition and Black Peter, are commonly acknowledged as the formal beginning of the new wave. They brought realism back into the equation, with films focusing on the non-heroic citizens in everyday life. These films were an attempt to snub the status quo and reject traditional narratives, a new look on society seen with fresh eyes. Forman once stated, "Many years ago, people used to say, 'It's like in a film,' meaning that it was incredible. Later they said he filmed it marvelously, meaning that someone hoodwinked the others and now a third phase is being used when filmmakers want spectators to believe what they see on the screen. He and his team like to focus on the life, joys, and sorrows of ordinary citizens, allowing their films to fall in the neo-realist category, cemented by their use of non-professional actors and focus on everyday environments. Cinema verite, the French documentary movement which showed people in everyday situations, along with a natural use of dialogue and actions, was a clear influence for the New Wave. It helped solidify the feeling of social reality with an experience of true authenticity. Choosing not to revel in linear narrative, and often using a mixture of both actors and members of the public, the directors relied on their characters to highlight the social realities of everyday Czech life. Along with the social realism, the New Wave was defined by whimsical and fantastical films inspired by pre-war literature from the likes of Kafka, Nesval, and Van Cura, bolstered by the surrealist traditions. While surrealism in France during the French New Wave developed from Dada, in Prague it grew from poetism, pre- and post-war authors, and the diva style movement of the 30s. For Czech New Wave filmmakers, the liberalization of culture that took place in the 60s brought with it the permission to portray contemporary reality, complete with all its contradictions and complexities. The liberalization was not complete, however, so the films often conveyed their meaning in an ambiguous manner in order to pass by the censors. As a result, not only objects, but words, situations, and characters in Czech New Wave films could be interpreted in more than one way. As Ivan Passer put it, censorship forces filmmakers to find a language which the censors don't pick up on immediately, and because of that, the language becomes ambivalent. It is able to express more than just definitions. One of the most explicit examples of surrealism used as a mechanism to display the conditions of everyday life in Czechoslovakia is Vera Hekalova's Daisies. The film follows a pair of hedonistic young women, both named Marie, who, when adopting a philosophy based on the question of, if the entire world is bad, why shouldn't we, embark on a gleefully debauched odyssey of gluttony, giddy destruction, and anti-patriarchal resistance, in which nothing is safe from their nihilistic pursuit of pleasure. Hekalova described her own film as a philosophical film in the form of a farce, which allowed it to be interpreted by fellow filmmakers and citizens, but not recognized as an attack of modernity and authority by the government censorships. Daisies uses absurd surrealist representation of the world, almost like bizarre realism, that allows the viewer to ponder the hidden aspects of the world they live in and offers a fresh perspective from which to initiate reflection on the presence of ideology in everyday life. 1968 was one of the most polarizing years in Czechoslovakia, ushering in reforms and revolution only to have it eradicated by Soviet occupation and strict censorship. Alexander Dubček rallied the support of party and economic reformers, as well as Slovak nationalists, against the leadership of Antonín Novotný for secretary in 1967. Dubček won and took office, allowing for the new era of Czech government and arts to flourish. This reformed version of state socialism had many manifestations. Censorship had been abolished, as had travel restrictions for ordinary citizens. Civil society began to flourish once again, and the states began to roll out a series of political and economic reforms to accompany the societal changes. During the early months of 1968, the Czechoslovak press was granted greater freedom of expression, and victims of political purges during the Stalin era were rehabilitated. The trend of developments aroused concern in the Soviet Union. Dissatisfied with developments in Czechoslovakia and fearful of the implications of liberalization, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies invaded the country the night of August 20th. Dubček and 5 other Presidium members were seized and taken to Moscow, where the Soviets wrested major concessions from them. On his return to Prague, Dubček gave an emotional address to his countrymen, requesting their cooperation in the curtailment of his reforms. The end of the Prague Spring meant the end of the Czech New Wave, and in the aftermath of the invasion, all New Wave films were banned by the communist regime, and most were not seen again until the Velvet Revolution of 1989. This surveys the power of cinematic commentary, with films that, despite heightened censorship, influenced filmmakers all around the world and changed how the world viewed cinema forever.